Welcome to the Libertarian Institute channel and Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. Today I'm joined by Thadeuss Russell, the founder of Unregistered Productions, Renegade University, the host of the Unregistered podcast, and author of A Renegade History of the United States. Today we'll be discussing World War II, the Great Blowback. This is a class Mr. Russell will be doing June 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th. Link will be in the description below. Dr. Russell, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Keith, thanks so much for having me on. I love talking about this.
Dr. Russell, why is history important?
You know, I dislike so many things about my profession, which is the historical profession. I'm a Columbia PhD in history, and I've been a history professor for almost 3 decades now. I dislike so much of it, mostly the content, the politics of it, the narrowness of the ideology that's represented in the historical profession, on and on. However, there's certain things that I really love about my profession and the study of history. And for us, for historians, I think this is almost universal among us. You know, we believe that nothing is transhistorical, meaning that nothing is eternal and permanent and never unchanging. We believe that everything is historical in that sense, meaning that it is contingent upon real people and events and ideas and history changing over time. We believe that change is constant, that there's never been anything that is static, certainly not in the realm of ideas or culture, politics, or economics. And so there is always more to look at, because there is nothing but dynamism in the past. There is nothing but constant change in every quarter of society, and even outside of society. Things are always changing. And so our jobs are never done, but that's what makes it beautiful. That's one reason I love history. The other is that I actually, psychologically, I get transported into the past by doing it. And it's almost like it's in a form of escapism for me. I really love it. I really feel better when I'm studying and researching history and writing it. I feel like I'm not quite in that place in the past, but I certainly don't feel like I'm in this place anymore. And that's nice. It's nice to be thinking about people who are so long dead that there's no sort of feelings about them dying or about, any of the tragedies, necessarily. The third reason, and this is why I became a historian, is that I was interested in politics, like you and like many of our friends, people in our world, as a very young person. And I pretty soon saw that the people who knew history won all the arguments. That if you knew history, you could win virtually any political argument. And that's true. It's very difficult. And it's actually quite annoying to argue with someone who knows a lot of history. And when you don't, I understand that as well, because it's impossible, right? If they have this whole trove of information that you simply don't have access to, it's impossible to really engage with them in any serious way. So historians, those of us who actually do spend the time doing the research on this stuff, we always have an upper hand in the arguments. It doesn't mean we're right. It just means we have a big advantage. And so there is no political question to me that isn't best answered by looking at history.
Imagine you have to hire a sole historian for Renegade University. They're in charge of all the history. When looking at potential historians, what would you say differentiates a good historian from a bad historian?
Just quick correction. I am no longer with Renegade University. So it's all my courses are at the Unregistered Academy on my Patreon. But just so you know, it's a brand new thing. I don't blame you. I was with RU for a long time. I did found it, but I went in another direction just recently. So you can go to patreon.com/unregistered for all the things that I'm now offering. So what kind of historian would I not hire? Well, I just hired David Beto, who's a very important libertarian historian at the University of Alabama, who's written 4 or 5 very important books that have been almost completely ignored by the historical establishment because he's got the wrong politics. David's books are immensely important. They're unique, and they add a ton to our understanding of mutual aid among poor and working class people, the history of armed self-defense by African Americans, self-help by African Americans under Jim Crow. He's now got a new book he's working on Franklin Roosevelt's full-on assault on civil liberties. These are the things that you're not allowed to really talk about you know, in the left liberal establishment, which is academia. And David's managed to carve out a little corner and have a job in Alabama, but no one ever pays attention to his books. So that's why he's on my podcast right now this week. He's on a new episode. And he and I will be teaching a big course, 5-part course, June and July on the JFK assassination, various theories about it. And both David and I were not that interested in it before, but there's a lot of brand new work out that makes it much more interesting and suggests that there was a lot more to it than standard historians like us have been led to believe. The reason I hire a historian like David Beto is that David asks questions that no one else is asking. He's curious about things that other historians are not curious about. He's not afraid of making any argument. He's not afraid of letting the evidence determine what the argument will be. He wants to just tell a different story, and he just sees a different history than typical historian. So the kind of historian I wouldn't ever hire is someone who's simply incurious. I mean, but that goes for anyone. I don't like to have friends who are incurious. I don't want to have anybody teaching me or anybody else who's incurious. And that is most of the academic profession, in my opinion. They're actually incurious people. They're not curious about ideas that are contrary to their own. They're mostly propagandists. Not all. There are some professors I've known who are genuine, authentic intellectuals who really love ideas in themselves, but for the most part, they're not. They're interested in advancing a particular politics, and so they're not really curious. They're not interested in really listening to ideas that are fundamentally different than their own. They don't mind dickering around the edges, but they will not ever go at the big questions about the welfare state or about the empire or about capitalism or about socialism. You know, on those big questions, they all agree, and there's no point in discussing it. So, yeah, other than that, I don't care. I want someone who's very curious, who's relentlessly curious, who wants to know about everything in the past and is not afraid to follow the evidence where it leads.
It's so interesting because all arguments that I had heard for World War II were bad history arguments in the sense of they were just boring, predictable narratives. So instead of, citing primary documents or anything, it was always, well, you don't want to go into Syria? Well, you know who else didn't want to fight? Neville Chamberlain. So you're kind of an idiot and a coward. Assad is like Hitler. But if you want to go to war with Assad and maybe even Russia and Iran, you're like Winston Churchill, the greatest of the greatest Brit that ever lived. What is why are historical narratives so important as opposed to just laying out facts? Why do narratives matter to people?
Well, because narratives become the truth, right? So once people buy into a narrative, once they believe a narrative, they then internalize it, and then the culture internalizes it, and then it becomes catechism. It becomes religious. I mean, that's true for any society. America is not alone by any means in this. So the narratives that are established about history over time, what's great about them is that, and this is where Michel Foucault comes in. He and the French post-structuralists and postmodernists identified this. They noticed that the narratives about history change over time. That the ruling elites change their view of what happened in the past constantly. They're always revising, what actually happened in the past, which leads us to believe that maybe there isn't one single true narrative, right? One single truth about the past. But yeah, so if you control, I'm not the first person to say this, if you control history, you control everything. If you control the narrative of what happened in the past, you control society, because you can fashion that story to fit your own particular requirements for power. So, for instance, in the United States in the last 50 or 60 years, one of the ways in which the Democratic Party has maintained its control has been to use this mythological sort of redneck right-wing figure, this usually Southern white man who has a Confederate flag somewhere in his house or on his truck and owns guns, and he's racist, etc., and he votes for Trump. And because they exist, and because of the long lineage of racist white men like that, the Ku Klux Klan, the Confederacy, and slavery, yada yada, we must have the following 29 programs to help African Americans, and nowadays to keep down the Trump supporters. So that's the narrative. I mean, the Democratic Party, what would the Democratic Party be without that narrative of racist U.S. history? I mean, they have nothing. That's almost every single policy has to be filtered through that narrative for them, to get it passed. And so that's just one example. I mean, Trump, make America great again. Well, okay, so there's a lot of talk among Trumpsters about how great America was in like the 40s and 50s, World War II, and the great prosperity after World War II, when there was people made enough money that the mom could stay at home and be a housewife. And it's this nostalgic thing. And the Trump movement, again, they control their own narrative, or they have their own narrative that's different. Again, virtually the entire Trump movement is dependent upon that narrative. Without that nostalgia, what are they fighting for? I mean, that's what it says on the hat: make America great again. So it's a nostalgic movement from the beginning that requires on a particular historical narrative. To me, both narratives, the Trump narrative about America being a wonderful paradise 50 or 60 years ago, and the liberal left democratic narrative that the United States has always just been a racist country bent on killing black people, they are equally true to me. They're equally true, equally untrue. They really are just narratives. Now there's evidence. There's lots and lots and lots of evidence. There's books and books and books and stacks worth of evidence to support either narrative. You can, in fact, look at the 1950s America and say, yes, in fact, much of the working class was getting paid better than ever before. And working class people, for the first time in human history, owned houses. And this was really good. We also know that this was during Jim Crow, and that not everybody was wealthy, and not all of the working class was so wonderful. And by the way, the jobs that made them wealthy, or relatively wealthy as a working class, they were in factories, like steel factories and automobile factories, working 8, 10, 12 hours a day, basically as machines. So, anyway, you get my point here. Controlling the narrative, establishing, controlling, and disseminating a narrative effectively is the surest path to power.
Great points, because of course they never embrace any humility or any complexity when pushing such narratives. They don't say, well, the example I'd use is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas. He doesn't even say, in my opinion, I think the benefits of the invasion of Afghanistan outweighed the cost. He just says, well, we know that we had to go into Afghanistan. Our hands were tied. We had no choice. But Iraq is where there might be a gray area. Notice how they've sold you already on the main bill of goods that whenever there's a problem, we need major state intervention, and we're going to have to kill tons of people. Look, you don't like it, go away and live in fairyland. This is the reality. Moving on. They never even question it. So that's the power. The power of the narrative. They don't even see that here is an opinion I'm putting forward. They just see it as a absolute reality that can go unquestioned. And that's why I love places that are able to bring us courses like World War II, the great blowback. What is blowback?
Well, I mean, so this is a concept that was invented by Chalmers Johnson, who's a scholar, or mostly of East Asian politics and U.S. foreign policy. He was not a libertarian. He wasn't an anarchist. He was a pretty normie, I think, liberalish scholar. But he saw, especially in U.S. policy in East Asia, over the last 50 to 100 years, policies that produced a lot of anti-Americanism, dollar diplomacy, rigging the system, writing deals, under the threat of bombardment, with governments in Asia, that basically allowed U.S. corporations, U.S. business interests, and the government itself to rip people off. That kind of thing. Losing sovereignty. How many nations essentially lost their sovereignty to the United States? Japan is just one of them. When Admiral Perry, sailed into Tokyo Bay and said, hey, sign this trade agreement or else, they signed the trade agreement, and a lot of people in Japan after that were anti-American. How strange. And then they were anti-Western. How strange. And by guess what? 41, they were really anti-American. So there's your blowback. Just in that case, Pearl Harbor was blowback for decades and decades of severe mistreatment of Japanese people. We haven't even talked about what the United States, I should say, did to Japanese in America in the 20s and 30s. Everybody knows about the internment. Okay, everybody knows about that atrocity. They don't know that every Japanese person in California was had their land and property seized by the state of California and then given over to white farmers in the 1920s, called the Alien Land Laws, right? They don't know that the San Francisco public schools were segregated between Japanese and white students. They don't know that there were pogroms, essentially lynchings of Japanese people in the streets here where I live in California in the 20s and 30s, long before the internment. So Japanese people had a lot of reason to hate the United States by the time Pearl Harbor came around. So that's just one example of blowback. But World War II in general, for me, is not all of it, but I would say most of it. Most of the deaths in World War II were caused by the U.S. entry into it. My estimate is about 2/3 of the 65 million. The current best estimate is about 65 million people were killed as a result of World War II. And my estimate is that something like 2/3 of that would not have happened. 2/3 of those people would not have died if the U.S. had not entered the war in the way that it did. So that's blowback, something like 40 million people, I think, dead. The way that Europe was divided after the war, where the Soviet Union controlled half of it and the United States controlled the other half, was not ideal for the United States or the world. Certainly not for the people living there. That's blowback. 500,000 American men dead fighting. That's blowback. It goes on and on. I mean, you established after World War II, they gave independence. They gave independence to Vietnam, and then took it away. And then the people in Vietnam became nationalists, and Ho Chi Minh arose. And there's your blowback there. Anti-Americanism in Vietnam became the Vietnam War. Same in Korea. Tons of anti-Americanism in Korea, largely as a result of what the United States did after the war and during it. Yeah. But the biggest blowback of all is the Holocaust. So I am the first American historian to make this argument explicit, but there are many British and German historians who have been making it for many years. And in some ways, I'm borrowing from their work. The Holocaust was not caused by the United States entering the war, but its fulfillment was guaranteed by the United States entering the war. What people don't know is that every year from the time Hitler took power in 1933 until the final solution began in late 1941, every year Hitler gave a public speech in the Reichstag intended for Western governments to hear, in which he said the following: "I have the Jews that you love so much. I will deliver them to you on our boats, on luxury liners if you want it. Will you take them, West? If you don't take them and you stop us from retaking the land that was stolen from us in the Versailles Treaty after World War I, which included pieces of Poland, and then also he had designs on Western Russia, which was not part of that. But anyway, he wanted to take those areas that if you stop us from taking that land, we will then kill the Jews. So you can take them now. I'll give them to you. But if you intervene militarily to stop us from getting what is our ancestral land, we will then kill them." He was using them as hostages. Well, the West, every single year from 1933 to 1941, the United States State Department, France, Britain, every single one of them refused to take any significant number of Jewish refugees from the Third Reich. Over and over and over again. You had Jewish organizations begging Roosevelt daily. You had rabbis going to the White House daily, begging them to let Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany come into the United States. No, denied. The only Jews who were allowed in to the United States from the Third Reich were people like Albert Einstein, who were scientists who were useful in building bombs. So there's that. And then Hitler kept saying, we are going to take Poland, much of which did absolutely belong to Germany. Almost everyone agrees. I mean, even the left wing in Germany agreed with Hitler on much of his territorial designs, ambitions. And he launched the invasion of Poland in September of 1939. The United States, of course, and the Allies intervened militarily. the United States through aid to the Allies, etc. And then Hitler eventually did enact the final solution in 1941. But the thing is, the plan for the Nazis and Hitler from the 19 teens until late 1941 was to expel Jews. They did not want to exterminate them. The final solution for Hitler and the Nazi leadership was always to move them out, forced migration, move them out of Germany and out of the Third Reich when they took over Austria. That's what they wanted, because they wanted to keep them as hostages. They wanted to keep that power, right? And when the United States ultimately intervened and the West intervened, then Hitler no longer had use for these Jews, and that's when he gave the order for the final solution. So this is in the late fall or early winter of 1941. This is after Pearl Harbor. This is after the declaration of war by the United States on Germany. And the first gassing of Jews, the first killing of Jews in an extermination camp, a camp that was designed for this, was in Chelmno, Poland, the day after the United States declared war on Germany. Now, people will say, and people often do say, that there were mass killings of Jews before then, and that is absolutely correct. It happened during Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Russia, of the Soviet Union, which began in June of 41. This is when the German army just went hog wild, rushing through Poland, taking as much as possible and killing as many people as they could. But this was not the killings of Jews that happened at that time were actually against the direct orders of Berlin. That Hitler and the leadership of the Nazi Party did not want that. They wanted to kill all of the Polish leadership, and they wanted to kill all the Polish intellectuals. The Jews were they were not important in this campaign, and Hitler didn't want his soldiers spending their time running around sadistically shooting Jews in the head, which many of them did. He wanted them to focus on the job at hand, which was to seize this country and get rid of the political leadership of Poland, which was not Jewish. So we know this. We know this was policy. We know that Berlin did not order the killings of Jews, not in the way that was done, that they were interested in taking Poland and liquidating the ruling class of Poland and taking it over. But that was not the plan. Was to put the Jews in ghettos, which they did, and then in an orderly way march them out or train them out of the Third Reich to any country that would take them. And here's the thing that many people don't know. Hitler and the Nazi Party of Germany in the 1930s co-founded essentially the State of Israel, because there was a program by which the Nazi government gave material assistance and training to any Jew in Germany who was willing to move to Palestine and settle there. So that was just an agricultural area. So they had farming programs for Jews. The Nazis ran programs that trained Jews how to run farms so that they could move to Palestine. It paid some of them cash money. It provided them with the transportation to Palestine. Many, many thousands of Jews, with the direct assistance of the Nazi government, moved to Palestine and helped found the State of Israel. Because this is what they wanted. They wanted the Jews to get out. They were not interested in mass extermination. Why not mass extermination? Mass extermination was what was done or attempted by Russian anti-Semites, famously, before Hitler was anything important, right? This the infamous pogroms in Russia, which had been going on for centuries and were especially common in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Hitler looked down on that. You know, he didn't like Slavs. He thought Slavs were racially inferior people. Russians were inferior. And he saw that as irrational, he called it. Irrational, emotional anti-Semitism. He said, what we do, the Nazis, us, we are rational anti-Semites. We don't run around cutting off people's heads and shooting them dead in the street. We line them up, put them in cattle cars, and move them out of the country forever. So the Nazi leadership spent 7-8 years in the 1930s after taking power looking for places to put the Jews. They sent many of them to Palestine. Winston Churchill stopped that he started bombing the ships that were taking the Jews to Palestine, by the way. Once that ended, then they looked to Madagascar. The Nazis spent a lot of time investigating Madagascar. They sent missions down there to investigate it. They were getting ready to send Jews on ships to Madagascar. They kept begging the United States and France and Britain and all the allies to take the Jews. They kept saying no. So they had nowhere to go. The Jews were trapped there. And then Winston Churchill in 1939, after the invasion of Poland, he established a naval blockade of Germany. No person could go in or out of Germany after that time. Winston Churchill trapped those people in Hitler's house. They refused to take the refugees, and then he trapped them inside the house as Hitler was burning it down. Oh, and then they started dropping bombs. The British RAF starts bombing the cities during this time. The German civilians, all that happens. This is blowback, of course. When you start bombing people, the civilians in that country tend to rally around the leader in that country during wartime. So that's all it did. It helped Hitler's cause, and it did nothing except ensure that the Jews in that country would die. And we have just some of the most heart-wrenching memoirs and letters from Jews living in Berlin and other cities during that time who said at the time that, especially that the United States in 1941 was coming into the war, they said, now that the United States is coming to the war, we are dead. We are dead because Hitler has no reason to keep us around anymore. And that's exactly what happened. The day after the United States declared war on Germany, they started gassing Jews, and the final solution began.
Niall Ferguson has attempted to summarize the response by Henry Kissinger to the concept of blowback. So he said in his book, as Kissinger pointed out to Arianna Felici, the history of things that didn't happen needs to be considered before we may pass any judgment on the history of things that did happen. We need to consider not only the consequences of what American governments did during, say, the Cold War, but also the probable consequences of the different foreign policies that might have been adopted. Looking at it that way, is there anything that might come to mind and say, well, yes, technically, if the U.S. doesn't go in, but then again, what if Germany took basically from France to Russia with Franco running Spain, Salazar later in Portugal, and Mussolini in Italy, and Hirohito in Japan? How would the world look then?
Yeah, all of those guys would be dead, and their regimes would be long dead. So I spent a lot of time in the book that I'm working on examining the political economy of Nazi Germany. People don't do this nearly enough. If it weren't so horrific, it would actually be comical. So Nazism as a governing ideology is a snake eating its tail. There is virtually no way for it to sustain itself. So the anti-Semitism alone was nearly lethal for the entire German population. Why? Well, what's the first thing that Nazis did when they came to power in 1933? They removed all the Jews from the professions. All the professions. Okay, so Germany in circa 1932-33, Jews in Germany occupied which professions? Well, let's start with the medical profession. So something like half of all the doctors in Berlin were Jewish. And overnight, they were removed from their jobs. So there were half as many doctors now in Berlin. Oh, gosh. Okay, Jews were also very prominent in the food industry, not the agricultural production side, but at the retail side and the warehousing side. They removed all of them from the food industry in Germany, okay? So what was the consequence of that? Starvation. The average height of the German child declined during the Nazi rule in the 1930s. The average height of every other European country went up during that time. People couldn't get enough food. They couldn't get enough medicine because they removed the people who were providing those things. Oh, here's a good one. German Jewish doctors pioneered the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases. They were the first ones to do this. Really heroic people, actually. Saving people from awful diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. Almost all the research and all the treatment for that in the world at the time was going on in Berlin by Jewish doctors. 90+% of the doctors in Germany who were treating sexually transmitted diseases were Jewish. Well, they got removed too. Guess what happened, Keith? The rates of syphilis and gonorrhea, I mean, these are things that cause blindness. They are debilitating. They can kill you. They skyrocketed. So the German people are suffering tremendously from the lack of Jews in their society. I mean, people who were providing essential services, essential services. We haven't even talked about the intellectuals and the banking sector, the financial sector. Removing the Jews from German society at that point was catastrophic in itself. But then the logic of Nazism is we must have living space, Lebensraum. Everyone knows this, right? That was the partial justification for taking Poland and West Germany. Hitler believed that the cities were too crowded, yada, yada. So we've got to go east and get new land, right? So we can put our people in places where they have more breathing room, living space. Okay, well, that requires a very large military. Okay, well, the thing is, you've got to staff that military. And the thing is, the military requires things like copper for its bullets. Bullets had copper in them, right? You don't have a bullet if you don't have copper. Well, the problem is Germany had no copper. The other thing that Germany insisted on at this time, Nazi Germany, was to be completely self-sufficient. Autarky was what it was called. So they cut off imports. They didn't want imports from any foreign corrupting influence, right? Well, they stopped. They no longer were importing copper now. So that meant they had to invade further, more countries. The agricultural sector in Germany, to find the copper and the natural resources, the agricultural sector in Germany was denuded of labor to build the bombs and tanks to invade Poland with. So that's another reason people were going hungry in Germany. There weren't agricultural workers. They were being used for military production. So starvation's happening in Germany. We have to invade more country. We have to invade more of Poland, more of Western Russia, more of other places to get the agricultural goods, to get the produce, to feed our people, right? It's an impossible task. And so Nazi Germany was collapsing internally. It was imploding from the moment of its inception. From 1933 on, for many reasons, it could not sustain itself. It was doomed to fail, doomed to its demise. In fact, I'm quite sure that had the United States and the Allies not intervened at all, it would have died long before 1941.
When someone looks at the Second World War, as I said earlier, the common thing is they always say World War II teaches us that appeasement never works. How do you respond to that mindset?
Appeasement, yes. I mean, so this is what they always use against us, right? Every time we oppose a war, we are Chamberlain.
Yes, and also whenever the police tell you to do anything, you have to obey immediately. You can never not appease the police, or else they can kill you. Everyone else, you have to vigorously stand up to for every single one of your rights, except the people that violate them the most.
Good point. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's so what we had circa 1941 was basically two very vicious regional wars going on. Very vicious. The one in the east between Germany and Russia, Operation Barbarossa. That war is that alone, just that piece of World War II, is still the most lethal, catastrophic war in human history. So I'm not minimizing it. And then Japan and China, and then ultimately Japan invading other countries as well, but mostly China. Brutal invasion, the rape of Nanking we know about, the enslavement of countless people. Awful, terrible wars going on, but these were regional wars. They were limited in scope, and historians are virtually unanimous in agreeing that Hitler's ambitions were never global. They weren't even European-wide. He didn't even want to control Western Europe. As I said, he wanted Poland and he wanted Western Russia, which he considered to be Teutonic territory, meaning the ancestral home of his people. All racialist nonsense. And of course, I would have been 1,000% opposed to him doing any of that too. But that's all he wanted. For people who are living in Poland and Western Russia, this is not a small matter, but that is all he wanted. He did not want Western Europe. He went into Western Europe as a defensive ploy to shore up his Western front so that he could go east. He was trying to stop the Allies in the West so that he could push eastward. That's why he took Western Europe. He had no intention of keeping France. He never wanted London. He couldn't take London. He had no landing craft. People don't know the Wehrmacht The German Navy had not a single landing craft. How on earth were they going to invade England and then the United States without landing craft? They had no troop transport ships. They couldn't transport any number of troops across the ocean anywhere, not even the English Channel. This is how we know he had no intentions of going outside of his domain. In Japan and China, it's clear as day, Japan never had any designs on any other part of the world. They certainly wanted China because they were dependent on the resources in China. Japan is a volcanic rock. It has no natural resources. They have to go outward to get their stuff, especially agriculture stuff and labor. And that's why they were in China. That's why they were brutally controlling and dominating China. But that's all they wanted. They did not want to control the United States. They didn't want to invade South America. They didn't want anything other than that. They were going to become a strong power just in their sphere. They would never be able to be dominated again by the West as they had been if they could maintain their control of China with the natural resources and build their military and industry in that way. So again, both regimes, horrible, murderous, brutal, and imperialist, of course. But their imperialism, all I'm saying, is much more limited than what World War II became. What the United States entry into World War II did was it converted two regional wars into a global war. And that's why I say, of the 65 million or so who died as a result of the war, roughly 2/3 of those were outside those spheres. The other reason that the United States entry into the war was so lethal and accounted for so many deaths is that many of the weapons that were used to kill people in this war on all sides, were produced in the good old USA, in places like Detroit and Long Beach. Even the Germans, they would capture American weapons and use them to kill people with. Same with the Japanese. But, the United States was flooding the world with weapons. All of the allies, and there are many allies, were using US-made weapons. The Soviet Union was using US-made weapons by the end of the war. They were killing lots of people. So just the death count, the body count, the United States is responsible in some way or another, directly or indirectly, I believe, for about 2/3, but certainly a major part of it.
Another one of the primary things that someone will say is, well, look, the U.S. didn't want the war, but our hands were tied after Pearl Harbor. This is another result of isolationism, as Ben Shapiro loves to remind us. Here is a book published in 1947, The Story of the Secret War, Pearl Harbor, by George Morgenstern. In his diary entry of November 25th, 13 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, Stimson, Secretary of War, expressed the dilemma in its baldest terms, describing the War Cabinet meeting in the White House. He stated, there the president brought up entirely the relations with the Japanese. He brought up the event that they were likely to be attacked possibly as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. What do people need to know about Pearl Harbor?
What people need to know about Pearl Harbor was that it is what Franklin Roosevelt and Mr. Stimson and many others who ended up in Roosevelt's cabinet had been wishing for, Keith, I kid you not, since they were teenagers. So I devote a significant portion of the book to a biographical study of Roosevelt and his crew. And he was reading about, thinking about, talking about, and writing about war with Japan when he was in high school. He was reading a man named Admiral Mahan's books. Admiral Mahan was a very famous military theorist of the 19th century who wanted the United States to be the global hegemon. He was unabashed about it. But the thing about Mahan was he was mostly concerned about Japan. He said over and over in his books that Japan must be confronted and defeated for the United States to control the Pacific. Roosevelt was a huge fan of his books, as were many people in what was then the foreign policy establishment. And he started reading them when he was in high school, when he was in boarding school. 16 years old, he was writing home about it and talking about the Japs and how we needed to do something about the Japs, et cetera, et cetera. When he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under the Wilson administration in the 1910s, he was calling for war against Japan, and Wilson and Wilson's cabinet, who were arch interventionists as well, were horrified by this guy, this young Franklin Roosevelt guy. They kept trying to calm him down. We don't need war with Japan. So he was going for war with Japan, as I said, since he was a child, literally. The very first cabinet meeting of the Roosevelt administration, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the very first cabinet meeting, Franklin lays out maps and plans for what a war with Japan would look like. And we have diaries of his cabinet members saying, what the hell was this? We weren't expecting this at all. That was his first. This is the height of the Great Depression. He had a lot of stuff to do, right? His first thing was, we got to go to war with Japan, and here's how it's going to go. It was going to be launched from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and certain islands in the Pacific, and he knew where the Navy was going to be stationed and where the Air Force was going to be stationed and how they had to have particular airfields built in islands in the Pacific so they could launch attacks directly. I mean, he had it all planned out before he became president, and he'd been dreaming of a war with Japan, as I said, since he was about 16 years old.
Unbelievable stuff. I have just two more pieces of evidence here, because you would not believe the emails I get every time I mention Pearl Harbor. This is really difficult for a lot of people to accept here. Here is the New York Times, an article titled "War Entry Plans Laid to Roosevelt," published January 2nd, 1972. Here is Churchill's own diaries. The president's orders to these U.S. Navy escorts were to attack any German U-boat which showed itself, even if it were 200 or 300 miles away from the convoy. Everything was to be done to force an incident. The president had taken this very well and made it clear that he would look for an incident which would justify him opening hostilities, Churchill told his war cabinet. And then finally, there was a document titled the McCullen Memo, which lists about 8 things that the U.S. should do in relation to Japan. The document ends by saying, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war. So this was obviously intentionally provoked. So with we've dealt with Pearl Harbor, but unfortunately we're in the war, and what are you going to do now? We had to drop 2 nukes on Japan just to end this hell on earth that killed 65 million people. After the nukes, the war ended. Therefore, nuking Japan was justified. What say, Dr. Russell?
I have talked to many World War II veterans who are very, very happy about the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because if they hadn't been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those guys might have been sent into a mainland invasion of Japan. Okay, now, what would they have been met with if they had gotten to Japan? Because by that point, every city in Japan, and people don't know this, every single city, and I'm talking about 50 to 60 major cities, including Tokyo, at that point, by 1945, had been burned flat to the ground. Tokyo was a tabletop. They had firebomb campaign one after the other. There you go. There were many of them throughout the years of the war, and Tokyo didn't exist anymore, as did most of the Japanese military by 1945. By 1945, the Japanese military was depending on teenage boys. The defense production factories where they were building the bombs and the tanks, again, staffed by teenagers during this time in 1945. So a mainland invasion of Japan would not have been fun. I'm sure there would have been many, many casualties, but would there have been fewer casualties than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I don't know. Would Japan have surrendered eventually if they were surrounded? Because by that point, mainland Japan was surrounded by the U.S. Navy. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had taken all the islands around Japan, and all that was left was the mainland. So, and we know that there was a lot of talk of surrender in the Japanese high command by that point. I think it's quite likely that there would have been a surrender. And if not, there would have been much less resistance at that point from the Japanese military than there had been on all those islands, all those awful, brutal battles on all those islands in the Pacific by that point, because they were operating, literally they depended on children, the military at that point, to make their stuff and to fight. And, the U.S. military and the Allies are not going to have too much trouble with that. So I'm not going to ever say to a veteran, U.S. veteran who would have gone to the mainland, I'm not going to say to him, you're better off, you would have been better off if we hadn't dropped the nukes. But from a macro level, a society-wide level, I do believe that fewer people would have died.
I wish you would have met my uncle. I think he passed away at 100 years old. He finally opened up about his World War II experience. He was conscripted, and he's sitting there, gosh, in his late 90s, talking to me about this. And I asked him, "Did you kill anyone in the war?" And his face goes blank, and he goes, "Well," he explained that he was part of the Air Force, and while he was flying, he attacked a Japanese fighter pilot and unfortunately was able to see his face just before he killed the guy. And here he is, decades later, talking to me about it, half a century later, crying about it against the Japanese, who, with all the propaganda, the average person is still able to feel this compassion. He starts crying and said he was drafted probably just like I was. He could have had kids just like I did. Why did his firing miss me a little and mine hit his? It's just unbelievable stuff. So yeah.
Keith, I'm really glad you brought up conscription, and this is another thing that people don't understand. Every single military that was in World War II, every single one, majority conscript army. Every single one. The United States was 2/3 conscripts. What are conscripts? They're slaves. We need to get over this, problem with calling it slavery. If conscription's not slavery, I don't know what is. Not only is it slavery, it's the worst form of slavery, is it not? Because you are not being forced to pick cotton. You're being forced to fight and die for a cause you may not care about. It is the worst form of slavery, and that's exactly what it was. 2/3 of Americans in the war were conscripts. In places like Germany, the Wehrmacht was 90%. The German military was 90% conscripts. This is why I get furious when people describe all Germans as Nazis during that time, or they say the Nazi army or a Nazi soldier. 90% of those guys were not Nazis, and a lot of them were anti-Nazi. Same with all of them. British, they all relied on the Soviets. They all relied on conscripts. Absolutely. Slavery. So tells you the support for the war, for fighting this war on all sides was not so great.
Yeah, it's not exactly. France and Germany went to war. No, a few elites enslaved some people in their jurisdiction. Same thing happened on the other side, and a bunch of people got killed.
Yes, sir. Exactly.
Okay.
Perfectly.
So it's amazing. This, by the way, is referred to as the Good War. You would think that the Good War would be like, I don't know, Serbia 1999 or like Iraq War I, something that had like very few casualties. I shouldn't say Serbia had very few. Something you would think that just had so few casualties and the costs were so small and the benefits were so big. But 65 million deaths, you can't question this. It's inherently good. Here is, tell me if I'm reading this incorrectly. I want to know what you hear in this statement. Here is Churchill in March of 1948 in a book titled The Gathering Storm, Volume 1 of his memoirs. One day, President Roosevelt told me he was asking publicly for suggestions about what the war should be called. I said at once, the unnecessary war. There never was a war more easy to stop than that which has just wrecked what was left of the world from the previous struggle. The human tragedy reaches its climax in the fact that after all the exertions and sacrifices of hundreds of millions of people and the victories of the righteous cause, we have still not found peace or security, and that we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted.
That's one of the greatest mass murderers in history saying that too, by the way, Winston Churchill. As I said, he trapped the Jews inside of Germany. He refused to take the refugees, and then he put a blockade around Germany. Just think about that.
He put a blockade around Germany in the First World War as First Lord of the Admiralty.
That's right. A starvation block. So he's starving everyone and trapping the Jews inside as well. Yeah. And the thing about Churchill was he was absolutely ruthless. He just did not care much at all about killing lots of civilians to achieve a particular war aim.
The costs of the Second World War, besides the Holocaust and everything else you've mentioned. But what else do you say to get people to say that this isn't the Great War? There were a ton of unintended consequences. What would you say those were if you had to lay them out?
Yeah, well, the tens of millions of people, as I said, who died, I think because either directly or indirectly because of U.S. entry into the war. the planet was reshaped. I mean, countries were created, other countries were dissolved. People found themselves overnight being citizens of a new country that they previously didn't belong to or didn't want to belong to. You have half of Europe, half of Eurasia now behind an iron curtain, under communism, under a brutal Stalinist dictatorship. You know, in Russia alone. So I went to the Soviet Union. I was in the Soviet Union in 1987. It's in its last years. And they took us to a military cemetery, just World War II. It was a World War II cemetery. This was in Moscow. And it was so big, you couldn't see the edges of it. When you were standing in it, it went off to the horizon in every direction. And it was one mass grave after another. Each mass grave was the size of a football field. So just a raised sort of rectangle of dirt about 100 yards long, and maybe, you know, whatever that is, 50, 30, 40 yards wide. And there was just one after the other of those going off into the horizon. That many mass graves. Each mass grave contained 10,000 bodies in it. 10,000 each one. So we know that more than 20 million people in Russia were killed in that war. Would Hitler have invaded Western Russia, the Soviet Union, the way that he did, and would as many people have died if the US had not been involved? He would have invaded. He probably would have lost. There probably would have been fewer casualties. But again, it became a world war as a result of US intervention. The war shaped the world in all sorts of ways, though. I mean, in a lot of positive ways. You know, a whole lot of technology came out of it that we still use today. And that's something that sort of libertarians need to grapple with. You know, wars are very modernizing phenomena. They accelerate innovation and production and technological advances. You know, could we have achieved all those things without killing 65 million people? I don't know. The other result of the war, of course, is what liberals are very proud of and happy about, and they're defending every single day, which is the establishment of the post-war liberal order, we call it, which is dominated by the United States. So, you know, NATO and the UN and GATT and the World Bank and the IMF and all the ways in which the United States upholds its empire was a result of World War II, and that was all planned in advance. This Council on Foreign Relations began making plans in earnest in 1939. They entered into an agreement with the State Department shortly thereafter to make secret plans for how the United States would emerge from the World War II as the dominant superpower on the globe, and they got it. They got all that they wanted. Now, you could say that was a good thing because there have, in fact, been fewer deaths by war since 1945 in the world. It's been a relatively peaceful time, at least in the modern era. But, you know, we do have Korea, we do have Vietnam, we do have Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's just American wars I'm talking about. There's been quite a bit of killing. Was the Cold War a good thing for the world? Seems hard to maintain that. You know, half the world under communism and half the world under a U.S. puppet regime of some sort, often dictators who were as brutal as any communist ever was. You had Cold Wars across the country, across the world, that became often hot wars across the third world, vicious wars in Africa, Latin America. They were fought around this because of it. Communism was doomed to fail. We now know that. Communism as a system was not sustainable. It was just like Nazi Germany, Nazism. It couldn't be sustained on its own. And that's all we needed to do. Leave it alone. George Kennan said this. George Kennan said in his famous long telegram in 1947, basically, they're crazy. They don't know how to run anything. Talking about the Soviets. They're paranoid, delusional. Their system is falling apart all the time. All we got to do is contain them, keep them from moving outward, and it'll fall apart on its own. That didn't happen. So 3 years later, the NSC, the National Security Council, writes NSC 68 saying, nope, as a matter of fact, we've got to do everything we can to roll back the communists, to take an aggressive position, to invest heavily in the military, to build a lot of tanks and bombs and airplanes, and to go hard and to actually do everything we can to foment revolution within the Soviet Union. Regime change is what we need. And that was the policy. and has been the policy still to this day since 1950. NSC 68, I think, is still in effect. They are trying to roll back Russia still. It's just now it's Putin and it's not communism, but it is still Russia, the Russian bear, which has been getting in the way of America's globalist ambitions for more than 100 years now. And that's why Russia has been in our sights for, many decades. Because of that, they wouldn't play ball with the American global managed capitalist regime.
Thank you so much for your time. I have two more questions for you. Every time there is a war, the intellectual class will tell you that the other side just can't be reasoned with. Saddam can't be reasoned with. You can't negotiate with Putin, can't negotiate with Hitler. You could not have negotiated with the Soviets except during World War II at Yalta and Tehran. But after that, they couldn't be reasoned with. Here is a summary of how Oswald Garrison Ballard, the editor of The Nation, wrote in The Great Armaments were the road to fascism. He says, they bring with them increased worship of the state, increased nationalism, increased state service, and therefore play into the hands of those like Hitler and Mussolini, who declare that the citizen is made for the state and not the state for the citizen. He said July 2nd, 1938. When you're dealing with this fascist mindset, is there a way to reason with an enemy, so to speak, that does not involve going to war?
You mean when the enemy is fascist?
Yes.
Is there a way to deal with them?
As if the U.S. regime isn't fascist, but you get what I'm saying.
Okay, so half of my book is about an alternative to military intervention, and the alternative in the United States has been to let Hollywood continue making movies, to let the music industry in this country continue making music and sending it abroad, sending it to other countries, to let Levi Strauss continue making blue jeans and sending them to other countries, to let American media be broadcast through satellite dishes now, previously through radios and TVs, everywhere, so that they can see how we live and how they could live, whether by moving here or by adopting some of our own practices. And it turns out that American popular culture, American material culture, not the culture produced by the government, or the military, but American pop culture, the stuff that we all like to do and buy and play with, has been really, really, really popular all over the world for more than a century. And in fact, it turns out that things like Real Housewives is much more influential among Iranian women these days than Sharia law, than the Quran is. There's a westernization going on at a rapid pace in places like Iran. And that's largely because people can watch our TV shows and listen to our music and wear our clothes. So you just let the beauty, the glory, the liberation, the freedom, the pleasure of American popular culture go out there, and that will subvert any authoritarian ascetic regime instantly. Because a Muslim regime, a communist regime, a fascist regime, any kind of regime requires the discipline of its subjects, of the citizens, of the people living in that place. It requires, most importantly, that they subsume their individual interest and identity to what? The interest and identity of the nation state. Well, good old American popular culture, whether it was jazz or rock and roll or Kim Kardashian, has always been about your individual pleasure and fun and freedom, not about some collective obligation. So that's why American pop culture has been the great anti-authoritarian solvent in modern world history. And that's the main theme of my book. That's the argument of it.
So years ago, you correctly said shame is the health of the state. And with this topic, World War II, it's always shame. Anytime you go to question, oh, you're a Nazi sympathizer. What, you think we should just appease Japan after they unprovokingly kill soldiers at Pearl Harbor? Could you be any more evil? It's all of this guilt and shame. What do you mean at a meta level when you say shame is the health of the state?
Shame is what's used to keep people in order, to discipline them, to make them go to war, or at least support a war. Oh, you don't support the war in Ukraine? You're pro-Putin. you're a bad person. And people clearly, many of them think that, and they feel bad. And then they wear the blue and yellow flag, and then they vote to send $40 billion to Ukraine. Boom. There you go. That's from shame. That's from shame. That's what all the blue and yellow flags are about, right? It's to shame those of us who don't want to do this, who are not interested. You know, like, we're like, wait, what? Where's Ukraine? Why is this important to us? How much money is going and where's it going? No, you know, those are bad people. Bad people ask questions about that. We know the Ukraine is a victim and Putin is the villain. And so what's the point of talking about it? We just have to do it. But it is shame makes the world go round for states. States love shame. That's how they get people to put on uniforms and march and fight and die. Unfortunately, there's more to it too. I mean, they also offer them belonging. You know, it's not just shaming, but you're dying for your family. You know, they present the nation state as your family. There's no difference between you and the United States. You are America. America is you. So that has given people cause to die and fight, you know, that they really believe in. And I think that's actually genuine and authentic. I just would rather see less of it among people, right? I don't think it's imposed on them. I think people really buy into that genuinely, and they really want to be part of this thing. And many of them have been willing to kill and die for it. And I would just like to give them other alternatives.
The course is World War II, The Great Blowback by Dr. Thadeuss Russell. Appears to be a 4-part live webinar, Mondays, June 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th. Link will be in the description below. Anything I missed on that?
No. So the main course description is ThadeussRussell.com/courses, but also go to my Patreon. If you become a patron at the $50 level, you can take this course and all the courses for free. So that's at patreon.com/unregistered.
Thank you to everyone for watching Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Dr. Russell, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Keith. This was fun.